While DC Comics have certainly rebooted their universe in full multiple times over and over since the original reboot in 1985's Crisis on Infinite Earths, Marvel Comics has actually never done a reboot. And there's a piece of me that thinks Marvel doing a full reboot would actually be a really good idea. There's an article up on CBR saying Marvel should do a full reboot, and I get one there and I'm like, thankfully, somebody's actually on the same page that I am, that I know they've never done it. It would be a risk, but I think it would be a risk willing to take. And then when I got done reading the article, I was like, they should never do that. That is the worst idea in the history of the world. And I don't know if it's the guy writing, I think his name was like Maxwell Pishney or something stupid like that. He's got a lot of really stupid takes on comic books. I thought he was going to nail this one, and I wasn't going to be a hard sell on the full Marvel Comics reboot. But once he laid out the reasoning why he thinks it should happen, I've come to the realization that I don't think it should happen. I definitely want to hear from you guys. Do you think the Marvel 616 should be rebooted in full, start back, have an event happen, bring it back to zero, wipe out all the history, and start over again? I thought at one point it would be a good idea. I know Doc doesn't want a full reboot. He wants like a Bobby Ewing Dallas moment where fucking Spider-Man wakes up in 2000, probably like 11 or something like that, and was like, I had this weirdest dream that all this stuff happened, but all that crap actually didn't happen. He just wants to go back to the last time it was good. He thinks that would be a better solution. I've always been easily swayed on this argument, but I am no longer. I'm fully against the reboot idea, but let's hear what Maxwell had to say. Marvel Comics has had great success in the superhero landscape over the decades. The only problem with the comics giant and its gigantic catalog of series and stories is that it is nearly impenetrable for new readers curious about the characters and stories. With so many new fans flocking to comic book shelves because of the success of live-action films and television series of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it is vitally important that Marvel's comic book branch is ready and waiting to meet the demand of this large group of eager new readers. Unlike their distinguished competition at DC Comics, Marvel has never done a full-on universe-wide reboot, and it seemed perhaps that is exactly what they need to do. So the reasoning he thinks they should do it is because there are so many Marvel Cinematic Universe fans that are waiting to be converted to comic book readers. That is false. Actually, that's been proven to be completely false over the years. Remember we got that stupid Facebook fucking poll, as they called it? And it was just girls saying they liked the Marvel Cinematic Universe because they went to the movies with their boyfriends and they put it on Facebook. Like, look, 50% of the audience is female. It turns out none of them ever really went and read comic books. Or maybe some of them did. Maybe 0.5%. There's something minuscule like that. The conversion from Marvel Cinematic Universe to comic books is not as cut and dry as, well, if they like the movies, they'll like the comic books. It's a completely different format. It's released differently. It's a different medium for entertainment. And there's actually no proof out there that movie fans are waiting to become comic book fans. Now, there certainly is some conversion on certain types of animation. I would say that Invincible has been a very good success story on the part of Robert Kirkman and Image Comics and all that kind of stuff. You got the show on Amazon, and people went and bought Invincible. What's the big difference? The Invincible cartoon is basically retelling exactly the comic book series with very little changes. So once the story stops and the season's over and you want more story, you can go to that comic book and you can pick it up and you can continue on the story if you didn't want to stop. The same thing goes on with anime and manga. The anime to manga transition is very easy because they're basically retelling the exact same story with very, very little changes. While there certainly are stories in Marvel Comics that have been adapted to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, none of them are all that similar. If you go read Infinity Gauntlet thinking that you're going to get Infinity War and Endgame, I got another fucking thing for you. Like, that shit ain't going to happen. If you go to read Winter Soldier in the comic book after you read the movie thinking that you're going to get the exact same story but with some amplifying information, that is not the case. While it has some similarities, and it's certainly more similar than Infinity Gauntlet, it's not a one-for-one transition, and it's not exactly like there's a badass story waiting for you to read after Winter Soldier, although you do get to the death of Captain America eventually, which ends up being pretty cool. But the way that the Marvel Cinematic Universe works to bring readers in is in complete opposite of what something like an Invincible or anime is doing for manga. Like, there's no transition there, and I don't think you should reboot your universe because you think there's just a bunch of movie fans that want to read comic books. If they wanted to read comic books, they would probably already be reading comic books. It's not like they're that hard to find. You could definitely get them if you really want to. The problem is if you have to really want to be able to go get them. And I don't think a lot of people are just clamoring for a bunch of Marvel, comic books. It's obvious that they aren't because the sales numbers aren't very good. But he continues with his reasoning. Unless readers started out in the early 60s alongside the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man, chances are that most fans jumped in the Marvel train decades into its history. What used to be a somewhat easily accessible and understandable universe has now become so bogged down in its own lore and canon that new stories often feel like they are simply rehashing or reiterating aspects from a story written 3 decades ago. It's hard to develop new and exciting character arcs for heroes who have been battling ups and downs for the better part of 50 years. And I would say that the overwhelming majority of current Marvel Comics readers, myself included, did not start out in the 60s. I wasn't even born then. I started out much later than I started out in my 30s. So we're already in the 2000s, stuff like that. And it's not that difficult. I don't find the Marvel Comics universe impenetrable. I find the Marvel Comics universe infinitely easier to navigate than the DC Comics universe, simply because DC has rebooted their universe so many times and changed their history so many times. You might not even know what you're fucking reading if you go back in time. And so many of their things are Elseworlds, but they're more popular and important than their in-continuity canon stuff that DC I find to be much more difficult to navigate. It's certainly easier to find great stories because they're better with their trades and collected editions, but if you really want to get into the history of the character, it can get much more difficult for a character like Batman than a Spider-Man because Spider-Man's lore and history is basically uninterrupted. And I think that's actually an enormous strength for Marvel Comics once I started really kind of getting my mind into it. And I don't think it's too much to ask if people are reading Spider-Man. They're like, wow, I really like this gang war. Apparently I like this Spider-Man character. And like, I can't go back in time. I can only go forward. They keep acting like this guy has been through stuff, but I can't go back there and find the stuff that I want. There are plenty of lists out there. If you're looking for your favorite Spider-Man stories or great Spider-Man stories and moments, that you can go back and pick and choose the stuff that you want to read. There are plenty of collected editions out there. If you want to read through the history of Spider-Man, that it's not very difficult. In fact, I think it's super duper easy these days. And the way that Marvel Comics have done it, I do think is probably a benefit to the entire line, that there aren't all the reboots, there aren't the stops and starts, that everything that's happened essentially matters. It's in canon. It is part of the history of the character for good or bad. And sometimes it does take a good writer to maybe write themselves out of a bad storyline or a bad status quo for the character, but it's happened over the years. And I don't think it's too much to expect writers to be able to continue doing that and editorial staffs to be doing that. And I don't think 50 years of history is a detriment to a character like Spider-Man. I think if Spider-Man hadn't been around for 50 years, he wouldn't be selling like he is. You know what I mean? If he was a newer character, he wouldn't be ASM. There's a reason that people are attached to those titles because there is so much history, there is so much lore that you could almost, in theory, never kind of catch up. And I think that's kind of one of the cool things about being a comic book reader. And I think that's what American superhero readers are looking for. So I do think that Maxwell is completely off basis on what are some of the inhibiting factors and some of the reasons why you might want to do a reboot. He then gives a couple of examples on why he thinks a reboot would be successful. And this is where it really threw me off. And I was like, I just can't get behind this at all. The original Ultimate Universe arrived on comic shelves in early 2000s, reinvigorated the industry, as well as fan interest in Marvel stories as a whole. Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley's game-changing Ultimate Spider-Man was one of the most well-received and beloved series that the comics giant was releasing at the time. Fans flocked to it because it was a fresh start, a way to get in on the ground floor of a brand new look at the iconic web-slinging hero from New York. The original Ultimate Universe lasted for many years, featuring a series of ups and downs for its reimagined characters. It served as definitive proof that a reboot of the Marvel Universe could absolutely work. And I take away the exact opposite conclusion as the author in this one. I think the Marvel Ultimate Universe is certainly proof that you can do new things with the characters, you can re-update them in their own universe, you don't incorporate it into the original, and it can be interesting and popular for a time, but it has a shelf life which isn't anywhere comparable to something like an ASM or a Fantastic Four or the Avengers or a Captain America and all these other properties that they have that are still going strong, that they can continuously reboot and still do well in theory, with the right creators on it. The Ultimate Universe got canceled, like 12 or 13 years into it? It didn't have staying power because it wore out its welcome, because eventually you do realize none of this shit is in canon. None of this stuff is actually part of that character's history, and I might be wasting my time. I might enjoy this new take on the Marvel Universe that's happening, in a different multiverse, and I might like aspects of these characters, but in the big scheme of things, when it comes to the Marvel 616, none of them matter. You're reading stories that weren't important to the character. What happens in Ultimate Spider-Man doesn't really inform Amazing Spider-Man. What happened in Ultimate X-Men didn't inform the character that Wolverine is within the Marvel 616, and thus it became irrelevant and it died. And now they're doing an Ultimate 2.0, and they waited 10 years and rebooted it, and it's successful, and I imagine it doesn't have a 12-year shelf life like the first time. I imagine it's more like 4 or 5 years. It'll be quicker, and then they'll reboot it faster. They'll wait 5 years. They'll do Ultimate 3.0, and then people will be kind of interested in that, and it'll die off a little bit quicker. But none of these things have longevity. And I think that's the ultimate takeaway from Ultimate Universe 1.0. That's why you shouldn't reboot it, because once you remove the history and the lore in the canon, you remove the buy-in from your fan base, the consumer base, the people that continue to help you make money off Amazing Spider-Man, even though your stories right now suck, because they're addicted to the character. They have complete runs, and everything that they own is important. It all matters. Whether it's good or not, it still has some type of intrinsic value. Once you reboot that, that's all worthless. You've stated that none of that history counts. None of that history is important, and it ends up feeling like Marvel Ultimate Universe 1.0 that you might like. You might think there's some classic stories, and there certainly are, and it certainly informed the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but in the big scheme of things in comic books, it didn't move the needle like the Marvel 616. The next example, I think, is even more ludicrous. Though DC's New 52 was somewhat controversial among fans, it's hard to deny that it was home of tons of incredible stories. Even though it took away from some of the past DC works that fans love so much, the New 52 also provided so much new content for fans to fall in love with. A more successful DC reboot was in the wake of Crisis on Infinite Earths, where things changed more subtly, and it was more centered around streamlining stories and characters rather than trying to shift the tone and mood of a myriad of books in the name of unity. The core of a given book should absolutely remain intact, rebooted or not, and that is what Marvel could learn from the past choices of their distinguished competition. I fully believe with what has happened at DC Comics and the number of reboots that they've undergone is why they've never even tried it. Because I think DC have proven that once you do that initial reboot and you change things subtly and you're like, well, we got 3 versions of this character, we're going to get rid of 2 of them. This character, that's redundant, we're going to get rid of that. We're going to streamline things. And it kind of worked, and it certainly reinvigorated DC Comics, and Crisis on Infinite Earths might be the greatest comic book event of all times. Let's not undersell it. It's absolutely phenomenal, and it's amazing stuff, and really reinvigorated interest in DC Comics. But what it also did was it opened Pandora's box to whenever you thought the universe is a little unbalanced, a little too unwieldy, well, fuck it. Let's just do Final Crisis. Let's do Infinite Crisis. Let's do this crisis, that crisis. And now their cycle of rebooting just gets shorter and shorter and shorter. Whereas the first time, I think they waited another 15 years. It's down to like 2 or 3 years at this point before they just continuously reboot shit over and over again. And it makes all the stuff that you invested in obsolete. And if you were a fan of DC that jumped into the New 52, that pretty much sucks because all that stuff was wiped out. Because DC realized, like, whoa, we changed too much. We wanted to revamp all this stuff, but we didn't want to touch Batman, but we had to because of the timing constraints. And then we made Batman's canon and lore make no sense whatsoever. And we kind of like Green Lantern, so we didn't want to touch that much. But we had to fix Superman, and we needed to update him for a modern audience, that they made it unpalatable. Sure, it was very successful for the first year or so, but it had nowhere to go because it had no foundation to stand upon, because the foundation that they built was them just tinkering with stuff that was already working. You're likely to be much more successful to reinvigorate a character with a good creative idea that works within the confines that you've already created, whether you think it's good or not. The best example is what Jeremy Adams is doing with the Green Lantern. What Jeffrey Thorne did with the Green Lantern series was an abomination. It was atrocious. Some of the worst Green Lantern storytelling of all time. And what has happened at that? Rising out of the ashes like a phoenix is Jeremy Adams' Green Lantern story, taking all the pieces of something that did not work, putting them together in a new way to tell an exciting story and make Green Lantern work again. If you get the right creators with the right idea, you shouldn't be just rebooting, because once you do it the first time, it's so much easier to do it the second time. And once you reboot and you reboot and you reboot, you start taking away elements of the character and the history, and you start combining things, and nothing makes sense in the end. And I think DC realized that ultimately. And New 52, despite being a commercial success for the first year, I think everybody involved at DC would agree that it ended up being, in the end, like an all-time failure. It ended up driving a lot of people off. And the people that it did draw in eventually walked away too, because there just wasn't enough to work with there. They should not be rebooting this stuff at all. And I do think the Ultimate Universe and New 52 and all the reboots over at DC are the best example of why you don't do it. As soon as they reboot it, they're going to have to do it again in 10 years because, it's going to go off course. Like, well, do we want to do the hard work to get it back on course? Or do we just want to do another reboot? Fuck it. Let's do another reboot. That'll be exciting. And sure, it will be exciting. You'll get an event out of it. You get some renewed interest. But we found that the cycle of reboots, the drop-offs are so much quicker once you start rebooting too much. And certainly Marvel is experiencing that because they're always renumbering. But they've never actually rebooted their entire universe. And I think it would be an enormous mistake. After reading why CBR thinks it would be a good idea, I came to the exact opposite conclusion based on what he had to say. These are the final comments and reasonings for Maxwell. A universal reboot for Marvel just makes sense, and it's something that fans could certainly see being on the horizon. Though Jonathan Hickman's 2015 event, Secret Wars, one of Marvel's best events in its entire history, acted as a sort of attempt at soft rebooting the universe and adjusting canon for the sake of streamlining, it wasn't quite enough. The aftermath of Secret Wars just wasn't different enough from what had come before to actually be considered a reboot. Marvel needs to be stronger in their resolution to reboot the universe. They need to be able to definitively change things for an ever-changing world of readers and fans. And certainly, you could see that Secret Wars was supposed to be a full-scale reboot, but I imagine that Marvel got cold feet and decided not to do it. That's exactly where that Hickman Secret Wars, which is not one of the best events of all time, get that shit out of here. It's kind of readable, but in the end ends up being lackluster because they don't fulfill the promise of what they had set up in that Secret Wars. Because I'm imagining Marvel's like, wait, we can't do this, because they were clearly moving toward a full-scale reboot of the Marvel Comics universe. And then in that last sentence, he says, they need to be able to definitively change things for an ever-changing world of readers and fans. They've been changing things definitively for these new readers and fans, the idea of new readers and fans coming in for the last 15 years, and none of that has worked. It hasn't brought in new fans. In fact, it's only drove people off. Sure, you got a Maxwell Pishney, but for every Maxwell Pishney that came on board because he was really interested in Ironheart or Captain Britain and Rachel Summers being in a relationship and making out and having sex together, you drove off 20 readers that just wanted to read fucking good Spider-Man books. And that has been the ultimate lesson to learn from Marvel Comics of what they've done for the past 15 years, acting like, oh, we've got to change everything we do for this ever-changing world of readers. It turns out people that like superhero comics. And yes, you can entice some fucking morons here that really just want you to change everything for the sake of changing everything for their specific taste. But in the end, that drives off way more people and makes the product itself way less accessible and mainstream to just normal people that don't really care about, like, Pride Month. They don't really care about, is there enough transgender fucking representation? What's the diversity quota going on with Marvel Comics these days? Because if it's not good enough, I'm going to walk away. Most normal people don't give a flying fuck about any of that stuff. And those efforts have really driven people off. And I don't think they need a reboot. They just need to double down on quality, get a better editorial staff there, and really elevate the characters that they have that are already working, because the ones that were selling 50 years ago, the ones that were selling 30 years ago, the ones that were selling 20 years ago are still the characters that are selling today. The characters have not worn out their welcome. They haven't gotten stale. Certainly we could use better stories, but in the end, the best characters are the ones that sell, and you don't need to reboot the universe to do that. In fact, if you reboot the universe, you'll probably just fuck it up like DC has done multiple times. And certainly you'll wear out your welcome like the Ultimate Universe did the first time. Now they're on the second iteration, and it will have less longevity than the first one. You're better to just go on with what's actually worked for 50 or 60 years. Maybe I'm crazy. I definitely want to hear from you guys. Did Maxwell change your mind? Did he turn you? Do you think it's time for a full Marvel Comics reboot? I say no. If you appreciate what we're doing here, having fantastic conversations about really nerdy shit, because that's basically my specialty at this point, and you would like to support the mission of Thinking Critical YouTube, the best place to do that is Thinking Critical Patreon. There's a link in the video description. You show up, you find the tier that's right for you, you become part of the Thinking Critical team, you get a superhero name, you get a city to protect, and you get awesome bonus podcasts and other materials like that. Hope to see you there very, very soon.